All right. Just out of curiosity, how many people in this room self-identify as a manager? Show of hands. Okay, you'll notice most of the managers are sitting up towards the front of the room because that's just what managers do. How many of you self-identify as a developer? Show of hands. Okay, look around, managers. You are grossly outnumbered. You should take note of this fact because I will insult both of you equally. About a decade, well, actually almost 2 decades ago, a book came out, was very popular in the States, describing the different mental processes and approach and view of the world, etc., between men and women. It was entitled Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. The author, of course, was alluding to the idea that men and women are from entirely different planets and do not think like each other. And expecting, for example, that a woman to think the same way that I do, or that a man would think the same way as my wife does, was in itself something of a fallacy and therefore led to much of the difficulties in communication and emotional needs and so forth that men and women have. How many of you, just out of curiosity, completely agree with the statement that the opposite sex comes from a completely different planet than me? Show of hands. Wow, the rest of you are just lying. Now, turns out that developers and managers have some of the same kind of views of one another, and that's actually the core of this particular conversation, this particular talk, is that, look, if part of the way men and women, if they're going to be able to, in fact, be able to get along, be able to thrive, be able to work in harmony with one another, et cetera, we have to kind of understand where each side is coming from. We have to understand what those different viewpoints are, because otherwise we're just going to be constantly arguing over the same things. Now, fortunately, I don't think developers and managers argue about whether the toilet seat should be up or down, so I'm not going to be talking about that. However, we might argue about which way the toilet paper roll should go, right? And obviously it's this way towards, anyway. So the goal in this particular discussion is to begin the process of trying to explain these two groups to one another. Now, this being a developer conference, I expect, as was verified by the number of hands that came up, I expect most of us to be in the developer side of things, and that most of you will have more or less a developer perspective. I would also be willing to bet that most of the hands that went up as managers were developers at one point. Because if you'd never done any development whatsoever, you probably wouldn't be here. You'd probably be at some suit and tie affair in downtown London sipping champagne instead of coffee out of plastic cups. Right? Right. So there are a couple of ground rules that I want to set up. First of all, as I talk about developers and as I talk about managers, I am generally speaking to the stereotypes. Now, there is a positive and a negative to this. Stereotypes are there for a reason. In many cases, we create stereotypes because there is, unfortunately, a kernel of truth to most stereotypes, particularly because most stereotypes are considered negative. There is some element of truth to all of this. But I didn't have anybody in particular in mind. So if I've ever worked with you, or if I've ever met you or known you, and it sounds like I'm talking about you, I'm really not. I swear. I promise. That's my story. I'm also not trying to offend anybody. I couldn't even say that with a straight face. I'm sorry, that's just no. No, I'm trying to offend everybody. Okay? I will offend developers, I will offend managers with hopefully equal amounts. But the goal here is to try to break past some very long-held, deeply cherished beliefs in some cases. And the best way to do that, in many ways, is to hold those things up and laugh at them. I will also clearly mention that I tend to think of myself more as developer than manager, but over the last several years, I've actually been acting more as a manager than a developer. So I've kind of seen the wars from both sides, and in some cases it wasn't pretty, and I won't say which side that was. How bad is it? It's pretty bad, but let's talk about this. There's a particularly interesting, sort of compelling tale in a book called Rapid Development by Stephen McConnell, where he talked about a project. This is a fictitious case study, but if this sounds familiar, I'm sorry. Project was on schedule for once. They were working with leading edge technology. They were mentoring some of the other developers in the company. They had actually managed to sign up for training class so that they get better at the tools they were using. They were doing some process revision to look for inefficiencies and eliminate them. And the developers were actually motivated. Right? Developers were showing up early and leaving late. They were excited. They were building something. This was all very, very cool. Then the tech lead met with the boss. And the boss said, "You're doing a great job. The project is really moving along well. So we're going to advance the deadline by 3 months. Because if you're on target, then it shouldn't be all that difficult to hit an earlier deadline, right? And in order to help you hit that earlier deadline, for example, we're going to cancel the mentoring program and we're going to cancel the training class because you're doing so well with this new technology. You don't need any of these things. And you don't need to worry about changing the process because we have a corporate standard. And so just do that and it'll all be..." By the time this conversation was done, the tech lead went back to her team, tried to figure out how she could spin this news to the team, and finally just said, "You know what, I'm just going to give it to them straight." Told them what management had told her. One of the developers said, "They just don't get it, do they?" At which point, all of the developers promptly started leaving the office at 5. It's kind of a sad story if you think about it. Actually, you don't even have to think about it. It's a sad story, period. Which brings us... Now, I realize that I am not in my home territory, but I believe the comic strip Dilbert is pretty worldwide universal, right? Is there anyone here who has not read a Dilbert cartoon? 1, 2 hands, all right, 3 hands. Is there anyone who read a Dilbert cartoon and didn't get it? He's like, "Yeah, that was me." All right. Dilbert, drawn by Scott Adams. Originally, Scott Adams actually worked at Pacific Bell way, way back in the day. If you've not heard of Pacific Bell, it's because it hasn't existed for several years. It was one of the baby bells that were broken up during the late 80s. Pac Bell later merged with Southwestern Bell and then later re-merged again as part of AT&T. And originally he wrote the strip just because he wanted to explore some funny ideas. Cartooning was kind of a side thing that he did. But he really hit a gold mine when he decided to publish his email address as a part of the strip. If you look at any Dilbert comic strip, usually right between the 3rd and the 4th panels in a standard midweek strip, Scott Adams at AOL.com is written vertically there, specifically so that people could submit to him stories, feedback. What did you like about the strip? And the ones that everybody genuinely liked the most were the ones about work. So he started collecting all of these stories about work to the point where for the last 10 or 15 years, Dilbert has been just only work-related comic strips. And the really scary part of it is most of the strips that you read in Dilbert are not something that Scott Adams made up. Most of them are, in fact, real stories, slightly twisted and changed to protect the innocent or the guilty, as the case may be. But most of these are actually real stories. He's actually got one of his own stories where he decided at one point that he was going to experiment and he was going to become a management consultant for a day. And he found a company that was willing to bring him in to do some management consulting. And so he decided that his only gesture towards disguise would be to wear a pair of glasses with a fake mustache. And he called himself Scottbert. He called himself Dill Scottbert. The company, which if I'm not mistaken was Kensington, the memory company. It was either Kensington or Logitech. I can't remember which of those two firms. They later allowed him to talk about this story because it's kind of funny. Because he came in promising to be a management consultant to completely revitalize your business. And he made it all up. He had these people doing totally nonsensical things. All right, now we're going to arrange all of the chairs in the conference room into an obstacle course. and you're going to run the obstacle course. And now, as the after-lunch activity, you are all going to take turns getting on top of the conference table and crowing like a chicken. And nobody ever bothered to ask him, why are we doing this? Because he is Dill Scottbert, management consultant, so he must know what he's doing. Finally, at the end of the day, with about a half an hour left to go, he finally whips off the glasses and the fake mustache and goes, "What is wrong with you people? All of this is totally made up, and none of you has for even a second stopped to ask me, why are we doing this? Because it's stupid." Stories like this don't exactly build faith in management. This one's going to be even worse. Most management that we talk about today actually stem from some research that was done about 100 some odd years ago. Frederick Winslow Taylor. Some of you may run across this name if you do any sort of management studies, reading, etc. He actually founded, in some respects, the Harvard School of Business. Some of you may have heard of this. This is a place where people with MBAs come from. It's supposed to be a nice place to get a degree. Don't know. He authored a book, The Principles of Scientific Management, in 1911. In it, he described principles about managing labor. Work smarter, not harder, direct quote. Has anybody ever heard that one before? His idea was that management and labor were two very distinct positions with very distinct responsibilities, and he set out to document with science the differences between these two roles. The idea here was that we wanted to create accountability, not just accounting, and he created some cost accounting methods to, quote, parse the financials of a firm down to its lowliest product. His methodology, 4 steps: analysis, selection, the scientific solution to the labor problem, and then scientific organization. You'll notice he was a big fan of the word scientific. His backstory: in 1899, he had this sudden realization that workers were not performing to their best ability. At the time, he was actually managing laborers who were loading pig iron bars. I don't know if you guys know what pig iron is, but it's basically the raw product that is melted down to make various steel products. Remember, in 1899, we were just really getting the Industrial Revolution up to its full steam, right? We were, particularly in the United States, it was sweeping across the country. We were just sort of pulling ourselves out of the mess that was the Civil War and cleaning up after all of that. And so what he realized was that laborers were loading about 12.5 tons per man per day. And he believed that this was not optimal. So what he did is he gathered a bunch of, quote, college men, this is his term, not mine, and gave them special stopwatches and sent them down to a particular section of where they were loading known as the farm. And he determined through science that the optimal rate that a laborer could work was, in fact, 47.5 tons per man per day, which clearly meant that the laborers were not working anywhere close to their potential. They could, in fact, be loading 4 times as many pig iron bars as what they were. For him, part of the job was to hire the proper workmen. Be careful, this is not going to be fun to read. For each distinct job, there is a type of man who is best able to perform it, a first-class man for that particular line of work. For the purpose of loading pig iron bars, this special man had 2 virtues. Number 1, he was eager to earn extra cash. Number 2, he was mentally sluggish, very stupid, about as intelligent as an ox. For the record, by the way, his determination was that Hungarian immigrants were the best type of men for these positions because, and he had reasons which, you got to remember, about 1900, it was totally acceptable to be racist. All right, wouldn't fly today, but this was all in the name of science. Then when we got to scientific management, the idea is that this would provide a basis for, quote, ensuring hearty brotherly cooperation. See, he had this idea that where workers were operating under this lump theory of labor, meaning there's only so much work And so if one of us works harder, that actually takes away work from some of the others. And so therefore, that if you work too much, you end up working yourself out of a job. And so therefore, it was actually better to go slow so as to stretch out the work. This kind of sounds familiar, right? You're getting ready to do some development work, and you know it's only going to take about 4 hours, but you really want to play Quake for like 3 weeks. So you tell the boss, it'll take about 4 weeks. And that gives you an extra half week to remember how to play Quake. And then, you do the work at some point, and the boss says, "What are you doing?" You say, "Compiling." Oh, okay, all right then. So what he did is he actually said, rather than try to look at the work as a lump sum, let's change the way in which we reward people. Let's, instead of charging them per hour, let's charge them per piece of iron. So this way, if you only load 10 bars, you get paid for 10 bars whether you do it in 1 hour or 10, right? Makes a certain amount of sense. And therefore, the workers who now understood that working harder would mean getting richer, they would then work to their peak performance in order to get more money. He has a couple of interesting things here. Planning and doing are the two elemental functions of industry, best performed by two different kinds of people. Labor is crude and industrial, but the science of labor clearly isn't. Laborers are bodies without minds. Managers are minds without bodies. Now, you guys have to understand, as we sit here and look at some of this stuff, we say, God, this guy sounds like a royal flying idiot. But he didn't at the time. Taylor in this movement is comparable to the Almighty. These are some of the things that were said about Mr. Taylor at the time. These are his contemporaries reviewing him. May well be the most powerful as well as the most lasting contribution America has made to Western thought since the Federalist Papers. The invention of industrial management at the dawn of the 20th century that turned enlightened policy and scientific discovery into global prosperity. I mean, seriously, these are some heady words. Impossible to overestimate the importance of the scientific management movement in the shaping of the modern corporation and indeed all institutions of capitalist society. This guy was like the Aristotle of the 1900s. As a matter of fact, by 1910, there was a newspaper that carried the headline, $1 million a day. This is what his scientific management was saving American corporations. He testified before Congress. He founded the Graduate School of Business, which later became the Harvard School of Business. And all of his disciples later went out and preached this same message. And there's only one problem with everything I just told you. He lied. It turns out that if you go back and do the research, if you go back and look at the numbers that he was quoting and so forth, they don't add up. This is a man who was compared to the Almighty, and he lied. Sorely exaggerated the cost savings in products. As a matter of fact, his science was never actually replicable. One of the fundamental tenets of science is that if you conduct an experiment, I should be able to conduct the same experiment and get the same results. So people went and took some of these laborers and said, all right, let's see you load some pig iron bars. Well, what it turned out, he calculated that 47.5 bars per day to be effectively a sprinting rate. The only way anybody could actually do that is if they were running literally back and forth loading these pig iron bars. They do that for an hour, and then he multiplied that by 8 to get what a full 8-hour day running at a sprint would be like. Because science. The guy lied. There's just no other way around it. But unfortunately, there is a truism which we see every day on the internet. The amount of work required to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude greater than to create it. This explains, by the way, Donald Trump. Let's flip it around. Let's talk about developers for just a second, because I've been kind of beaten up on managers. Developers, what do developers do? Well, fundamentally, what a developer does is connect with the machine, right? You talk to a machine every day. You write code. You debug code. You talk to other developers about code. If you talk to customers, it's usually about what the code is supposed to do. You kind of live and breathe around this code thing. But now, here's something that you may not have realized. It's going to be hard to imagine as we sit here surrounded by other like-minded developers, but this is a fundamental truth of the universe. Not everybody thinks like you. There's a story, there's actually a very good book, The Inmates Are Running the Asylum by Alan Cooper. And in case you don't know who this guy is, he's actually the guy that invented Visual Basic. Interestingly enough, do you know what the code word for Visual Basic was before Microsoft purchased it? Ruby. Not making that up. In the book, Alan Cooper does some very interesting things where he says, what do you get when you cross a computer with a clock? You get a computer. How many of you have ever purchased a clock from a store that has all these incredible features that you never use, and yet you cannot figure out how to set the time on the clock? Yeah? What happens when you cross a computer with a clock? You get a computer. What happens when you cross a computer with a video playing device? Something that's supposed to take these square black things and show you a movie. You end up with a blinking 12, right? Because we can't figure out how to set the clock on the VCR or the DVR or the Netflix tool. How many of you have ever had to reboot your television? Yeah, okay, just stop and think about that for just a second. To reboot your television. Because science. What happens when you cross a computer with a telephone? You get an iPhone. Or an Android device, which, let's be honest, you have to reboot those like once a week or so. Right? Do any of you remember telephones back in like the 1970s, right? Where they had the plastic cradle and you picked them up and they were actually tethered to the wall. I had a friend of mine who had one of his, I think it was one of his daughter's friends come over to the house, and she looked at his old 1980s phone. She said, "Oh, Mr. Rector, that's so cool. You've anchored the phone to the wall so nobody can lose it. That's so clever." Yeah, kid, that's how it works. What do you get when you cross a computer with a car? Yeah, you get a Tesla. But before that, you get a Porsche. See, one of the interesting things that cars have been doing for many years is they've been using onboard computers to be able to analyze the performance characteristics of the vehicle in order to be able to get the best performance out of them. And in particular, there was this one model, Cooper goes into this in great detail, but there was this one model of Porsche where if, in fact, it detected that there was not enough gas in the gas tank, well, trying to run the engine when there's not enough gas coming through could actually cause the engine some serious damage. So, as a safety feature, they basically would shut the car down. Well, what they didn't realize is that when you're in this high-performance sports car and you take turns at a relatively high rate of speed, the gas all sloshes away from the sensor. So the car thinks, "Oh shit, out of gas." So in the middle of this high-speed turn, all of a sudden your car goes boom, which is exactly what you want, right? And then, better yet, how do you reboot your car? You take it to the dealership, because that's the only way you can reboot your car. Because when you cross a computer with a car, you get a computer. Or a naval combat control system. The U.S. Navy was using, in this case I'm going to beat up on Microsoft Windows to run one of their guided missile cruisers. This is an umpteen million, if not billion, boat floating out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, unable to make better than 5 knots because Windows crashed. And the Navy forgot to install Control-Alt-Delete somewhere inside of the Command and Information Center. Or with an airplane navigation system. Turns out, when you're navigating, when you're in an aircraft and you're flying from point A to point B, there are all these towers down on the ground. And these towers send out a constant beacon saying, hey, this is where you are in relation to us. And autopilot will use these as a way to navigate its way across the scope of the earth. There's a story of a aircraft was getting ready to take off out of, can't remember the name of the airport in Colombia, and they were selecting their VOR station. Those towers are called VOR towers. They were selecting their station, and they happened to see one that, they're supposed to be TON, and they saw TOM, and they said, oh, we'll take that one. Now, it's dripping. The ceiling is dripping. It's a fairly common error to select the wrong VOR station, but in this particular case, it was a fatal one, because this 727 was taking off from an airport in Colombia that happened to be inside of a large gorge, a canyon. And the tower they wanted was over here, but the tower they selected was a little bit further over here, and so this aircraft flew smack into the wall of the gorge, and everybody died. Was there any reason why the software couldn't pop up and say, are you really sure you want this one? Because by our calculations, this will not end well for you. The FAA, of course, investigated and determined this was pilot error because they selected the wrong station. But you got to wonder, as a software developer, if you were the one who built the user interface for that VOR selection system, how would you feel right now? Let me ask you this question. Your manager, your users, the ones that we constantly go on and on about how clueless and how stupid they are. If you showed them this picture of these two buildings and said, are there any differences between these buildings? I mean, in terms of the materials required to construct them, in terms of the time required, the process required, how many of you believe fundamentally that your manager would look at these two and say, oh yeah, no different whatsoever? Are they really that stupid? How many of the managers are looking at that going, no, they look the same to me, honestly. Don't admit it, all right? Just preserve what little dignity you have left. And yet, all of us know, we've heard this story. It's like Carl Jung, the psychologist, who reasoned about the collective unconscious, that all of us share a collective unconscious. All of us know this story. Even if we've not experienced it ourselves, we know somebody who's experienced it. We felt it. It's like a ripple through the force. When the boss walks into your cube one day and says, hey, marketing wants to know whether or not we can do this project. So I need for you to create for me a prototype. And some in the back, are like, oh shit, I already know where this is going. And so you say, sure, boss, I can go figuratively grab some materials, slap something together, put it together in a week, show it to marketing. It's a prototype. Awesome, great. So a week goes by, boss comes back to you and says, hey, Joe and Fred here from marketing are here to see the prototype. You say, okay, great, cool. So let me sit you down, show you this thing that I just kind of cranked out using some mocks, and I threw some Bootstrap and some jQuery in there just to kind of make it look nice. And so here we go, and Joe and Fred say, that's great, that's awesome, ship it. And it's like one of those action movies where the hero's moving in, but it's too late, because your boss says, done. Thinking to himself, I have the most brilliant programmers ever. They did this whole thing. I thought it was going to take 6 months. They turned it around in a week. I am never letting this guy quit, ever. And so Project Doghouse goes into production. And so a couple of months later, because you're the one who did it, and you're the one who's now responsible for fixing all of the bugs around it, a couple of months later, you're like, hey, boss, there's a really cool opening in the team over there. I'm going to go, I want to go work for that team. And your boss is like, no, I will fundamentally deny the transfer because I need you for Project Doghouse. It is mission critical, right? And so you're like, fine, screw it. I quit. I go work for a company across town, but then at a Christmas party, right, you and a couple other friends, you're hanging out, and somebody introduced you to somebody new, and they're like, wait. I think I know your name. Didn't you used to work on Project Doghouse all those years ago? And you're like, ah! So you leave town. You go to Seattle. You take a job there. And you're quite happy for several years until all of a sudden you get this phone call. Is this so-and-so who used to work on Project Doghouse? Ah. So, you're smarter than this. Because even if you've never lived this, you know people who have. So what do? Well, rewind. Boss comes into your cube and says, hey, Joe and Fred from marketing want to see a little prototype thrown together. And you're like, ha, I know what you're about to do, boss. But I'm a software craftsman, and I don't do that shit. So a week later, when the boss comes back and says, hey, so how are we doing with the project? You're like, boss, iteration 0 is just about done. We've selected which source code tools we're going to use. We've selected which IDEs, the database. We've worked out a very preliminary architecture, which we'll need to validate with the customer. We're going to need some story cards. This project is going to be rocking in about 9 months when we ship this thing. And the boss is like, time out. What the fuck? I told you to put together a prototype, and you're telling me the prototype is going to take 9 months? Are you nuts? And he fires you. Now you laugh, he fires you. Because he wanted something in a week. He wanted to prove that we could do this project, that we could win the work. Because marketing's getting ready to go out and talk to some other consulting company who says they can do it in 4 months, and you just said 9. So your boss fires your ass. And you are happy to get fired because clearly this man is an idiot. He can't tell the difference between that and that. And you want to know something? Nobody can. Think about it. Software. Somebody please point to the software in this room right now. Where is it? Is it here? Is it here? Is it here? This is just pixels. This is just a screen. If I crack open the laptop, please don't do that, it's my baby. But if I crack open the laptop and I get out a really powerful microscope and I look at what's going on there, if I peer into the CPU, that's where I'll find the objects, right? That's where I'll see the threads running. I'll see the heap, the garbage collector moving through the heap, collecting these objects, right? That's where I'll find all of this stuff. Or are all of these just abstractions? On top of abstractions, on top of abstractions, on top of abstractions, on top of abstractions. At the end of the day, guys, all that's doing is going like this, oscillating between 2 voltage signals at billions of times a second and sending electronic impulses everywhere. Software is ephemeral. It doesn't exist. So then, your boss comes to you and says, hey, I want to talk to you about thing that doesn't exist. And you say, but boss, thing that doesn't exist will take longer because reasons boss doesn't understand. Because he doesn't see this. We don't see this. Look, at the end of the day, right, the human body is a very complex thing that we don't fully understand. But if I want to understand at least a little bit about how the body is working on just a surface level basis, I can walk up to the person and say, hey, how are you doing today? How are you feeling? Feeling good? Great. Feeling healthy? Deep breath? Good, good. Check your eyes. I can actually talk to the patient. I can get his subjective opinions about how he's doing. How do we debug patients up there in the software world? I don't talk to the patient. I talk to the debugger who talks to the patient. This is like going to the doctor with your wife. Doctor says, how are you feeling? I don't know how am I feeling, honey. He's feeling a little bloated. Yeah, I'm feeling bloated. Your spouse is your debugger. Does that make any sense? But that's what we do. Personally, I'm convinced that the internet achieved self-awareness about 15 years ago. And it's been toying with us ever since. Think about this for just a second. Next time you're looking at a program and it's coming up with non-deterministic results, that's the internet screwing with you. Because, hey, check this out. Watch. I'm going to show this guy wrong data just because. Watch what his face does. It's awesome. Check it out. Look at that. He threw the laptop out the window. That's awesome. This also explains all the cats, by the way. The internet is a big cat lover. I challenge you to come up with a better, more compelling theory. It takes a special kind of person to be a developer. Matter of fact, what kind of person? How many of you have heard of the Myers-Briggs type indicator? This is a psychology personality profile that measures things across 4 distinct axes. Now, it's somewhat subjective because they present you with a list of questions. Which would you rather do, A or B? Which would you rather do, A or B? And they built it along these 4 actions: extroversion versus introversion, sensing versus intuitive, thinking versus feeling, judging versus perceiving. Now, there's no right answers here. There's nothing that says introverts are better than extroverts or vice versa. There's certainly nothing wrong with being strong on thinking as opposed to strong on feeling. And Myers-Briggs has definitely been the subject of much criticism, saying it overly simplifies the complexities of human personality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But even within a certain generality and allowing for a certain degree of error within what they're doing, there's some very interesting patterns that are emerging, which is to say that amongst developers, 50 to 66, half to 2/3 of the computing population, namely to say people who spend their time with computers all day, is I dominant. We tend to be introverts. Does this come as a surprise to anybody? But the surprise is the rest of the general population, only about 1/4 to 1/3 are introverts. The rest are extroverts. So right there, we've only examined one of the 4 axes, and already we start to see a fairly significant difference in terms of how we approach things. Introverts will kind of want to think, whereas extroverts will want to talk. Internal versus external processing. 80% of computer professionals prefer thinking over feeling. Doesn't come as a huge surprise, except this also begins to explain why a lot of times developers don't really empathize well. Think about it. Code review. This code is bad. Fuck you! Maybe a better way you could have said that. Maybe a better way you could have reacted, but now they're both pissed. Aye. 66% of computer professionals are J's, meaning judging, planning, orderly execution, as opposed to flexibility and adaptability. Why? Because the computer is not flexible nor adaptable. The machines are training us. Think on that for a while. Tell me the internet has not achieved self-awareness. One of the things that managers struggle with, quite frankly, is understanding motivation. One of the things as a manager that I'm supposed to do is I'm supposed to help you feel like you want to come to work today. Again, Steve McConnell, Rapid Development, cited a particular psychology study where they asked a number of people to rank what would you prefer. In terms of motivations, what would you prefer as kind of a reward? What is the reward that you feel is most effective with you when it comes to doing some of the work? And general population, right? A lot of people like achievement, right? This notion of, hey, right, I accomplished something. And then second is recognition for that achievement. Not only did I accomplish something, but in fact, everybody knew that I accomplished something, right? Hey, if I've, just made a sales award, bringing me into a room full of people, bringing me up to the front and saying, Fred here just sold more refrigerators than anybody else in the company. Yay, recognition. That's rewarding for a lot of these people. For some people, the work itself or added responsibility, advancement. I get promoted within the company, which goes very much hand in hand with responsibility. Salary comes in like 6th. Reward me by giving me more money. Possibility for growth. But look at programmer motivations. Possibility for growth comes in 2nd. If you're a manager and you want to reward a developer, where does recognition show up on this list? Way down here at the bottom. You bring a developer up to the front of the room and hand him a certificate with, good job. Yeah, that's not motivation. That's kind of the other thing. But you send him to a training class, send him to a conference, help him grow in his or her career. Second on the motivation list. Third is work itself. Give them challenging problems to solve. Personal life. Does anybody still have one of those? I'm just curious. Send him home early so that he can spend some time with the kids because he managed to bust his ass on that particular part of the project. Tech supervision opportunity. Advancement. Sixth, interpersonal relations with peers. Let's look at managers. Number one motivation for a manager, give me more responsibility. Empire building. Give me more people to manage. More budget. Then comes achievement. Then comes the work itself. Then comes recognition. Then possibility for growth. Send me to a management class. Interpersonal relations with subordinates. Interpersonal relations with peers. You know what's missing from both of these lists, by the way? Salary. Interesting little tidbit. How many of you have heard of the candle experiment? This is an exercise that actually was established. Let's see, I thought I had a picture here, but I guess I don't. This is a psychology experiment that actually grew out of some work around primates, monkeys. But the idea is this. I bring you into a room because you volunteered to be a part of this psychology experiment, and I say, okay, I have a box of nails, a candle, and a book of matches. And I want you to attach the candle to the wall. Okay? So I have the candle, I have a box of nails, but no hammer, and I have a book of matches. How do I attach the candle to the wall? Now, without giving it away, it's interesting because psychologists are devious little creatures. Because if you know that you're being tested, you won't behave the same way as you would in real life, right? This is a well-documented psychological effect. And so psychologists, when they conduct these experiments, they have to trick you, which then itself becomes its own little game because you're trying to figure out what they're actually testing you on so that you can do well on the test, but they're trying to hide. They don't really care how well you solve this problem. What they care is how long will you attempt to solve this problem? How long will you try? There is a solution, by the way, but I'll only tell you after the session is over. Interestingly enough, if I offer to pay you to accomplish the work more quickly, now there is a financial motivation for you to get this done. So if before you were working, now money is involved. And so you'll work faster, right? Because standard economic theory says, look, maximizing my time, maximizing my utility, therefore, yes, absolutely, I'll work faster, I'll work harder, except you don't. It turns out that offering people money as an incentive decreases your actual productivity. And you can actually see this. Behavioral economists have seen this play out in real life. How many of you, just out of curiosity, how many of you have ever helped a friend move? Right? Pick up the furniture, carry it out to the van, to the truck, move it around, et cetera, right? And you did that because your mate came to you and said, hey, man, me and the missus were getting ready to move. Would you mind lending a hand? And you're like, yeah, sure, why not, right? And then your friend comes to you after all of this is done. 10 hours of hard, sweaty work carrying that sofa up the stairs, right? Arranging it in this room. She goes, no, let's put it in the other room. So you carry it into the other room. And then he goes, no, honey, I really like it in that room. So you carry it back to the other room. 10 hours of back-breaking labor. And your buddy comes to you and says, oh, dude, thank you so much. Here's a 5-pound note. How many of you would spend 10 hours of backbreaking labor for 5 pounds. Because I'm moving in a couple of weeks, so... Most people would be horribly offended by that. And yet, classic economic theory says you wouldn't, because now you're 5 pounds richer for something you've already wasted a bunch of time doing. Why aren't you excited about this additional little economic incentive? Because you are actually operating off of a different economic scale. You are operating off of the economics of friendship. The idea that, yeah, if I do this for you, you'll be willing to do certain favors in return for me later, like help me move, or help me work on my backyard, or this is on a completely different set of currency than standard pound notes. And psychologists have determined over time that incentives frequently don't work. They have the opposite effect. If I want to get people to donate blood because of some emergency that's happened, paying them for the blood will not do it. You'll actually get a lower turnout. Or paying you to be creative, like figuring out how to attach that candle to the frickin' wall, you'll actually work slower. You'll give up sooner if there's a financial incentive here. Now, the interesting thing is, if you're a manager and part of your job is to keep your people focused and motivated, and then you read about this, I can't just offer you more money. I can't just, wow, that like totally flies in the face of everything that scientific management taught us. It flies in the face of what Harvard Business Review goes on and on and on about, at least up until a couple of years ago. So where do we go with this? Well, first of all, management is hard. And the main reason management is hard is because it's about people. See, being a developer is easy. The machine is deterministic. All right? The machine, believe it or not, it's all deterministic. Threads, they add some level of non-determinism to it. But for the most part, the machine does not wake up one morning and say, I just don't want to work today. I just don't feel it. I don't feel passionate about running your HR whatever bullshit program. I'm just, no, sorry, I'm not going to compile your code today because your code is stupid. I'm sorry, no. People are not easy, especially programmers. People are not deterministic. What works for one person will not work for another person. And as a matter of fact, what works for one person may not work for that person next week. You say, hey, Joe, how's it going? Oh, man, Arsenal lost today. That sucks. Work hard anyway, okay, Joe? And on top of this, developers are not really like normal people. Look at the list of motivations. Normal people are like, yeah, recognition, trumpet my good deeds to all the world around us. Developers are like, you do that shit, I am so quitting. Managers, good managers, are about getting the best out of their people. Management is a people thing. There's a lot of debate as to whether management is art or science. Quite frankly, it's every bit the same as with development. Is development art or science? It's both, quite frankly. Management is very definitely art with some science, because psychology, philosophy, all comes in here. But part of what you want to do as a manager is, A, you need to coordinate people. People, in some cases, it's not about telling them what to do as much as it is saying, hey, did you know that you two are both doing the same thing? There was a great Dilbert strip just last week where Dilbert and the pointy-haired boss and another guy, and Dilbert says, oh, I've started a task force to examine all of the redundancies within the company. And the other guy down the table says, really? I just started one too. And the pointy-haired boss is like, oh, God. As the two developers are like, oh, now I'm pissed. Management is about dealing with that. How do you deal with that? Do you just merge the two groups? Do you tell one of them that they're redundant and let the other one go? And who do you do that with? And which one is going to be more likely to quit? And do you care if that person quits? Will they take too much knowledge out of the company? It's all about people. You ever thought threads were hard? Try managing people. Developers are good logicians and good artists because we have to think about some of these various factors around what does good code look like, etc. But for the most part, they only have to worry about massaging the best out of this thing, which is deterministic. It even has specifications. And if you screw it up too badly, you can always reboot. I do not recommend trying to reboot people. The police take a very dim view of that. Look, managers and developers are different. We have different things. We have different needs. We are trying to accomplish very different outcomes. And frankly, all of this is happening inside of an economic system that none of us control. As a developer, when you come to your boss and say, "Boss, why is the customer not giving us the time to refactor the application the way it needs to be refactored?" And the boss says, "Because they need it to ship tomorrow." It may not be because they hate you. They do. It's because they actually have run a marketing campaign that says that this website will be up tomorrow or this particular promotional needs to begin tomorrow, and they really genuinely need it tomorrow, regardless of any other concern. You do different things. Developers are not laborers. We're not loading pig iron bars. We're trying to be creative. We're trying to come up with these solutions. We are trying to fall into a flow state where we can actually feel like everything suddenly makes sense and we're slamming away at code and so forth. Unfortunately, scientific measurement does not deal well with creative aspects, right? Scientific management has not done well with musicians or with artists or with any of the other creative disciplines. But managers have to report progress. Managers have to tell their higher-ups how things are going because the boss's boss's boss can't just come down and look at what you're building because it's all ephemeral. It doesn't exist. We can tell because the lines of source code have doubled or tripled, or better yet, they've actually gotten smaller because we've been doing some aggressive refactoring. We can see it. It's all right here in the source code. But nobody else can see what we're doing. There needs to be some kind of visibility because the project has to be evaluated because we can't just keep throwing money away on a project that is never going to ship. How do we know? How does anybody know besides the developers? And even then, sometimes developers are like, "No, this is my baby. I will not let you kill it. I swear we're just 1 week away from ship." And 1,200 bug count, but just 1 week away. If you're a manager and you try to motivate people on what would motivate you, you're dead. It's not going to work. You think about the world differently. If you're a developer and you expect your manager to intrinsically understand what will reward you, that's also a recipe for disaster. Men are from Mars, women are from Venus. One of the things it stresses very strongly is this notion of communication. If there is something you want, say something. Boss, I would really love to go to that conference in the UK. Really, really love to go. Repeat this at like every meeting, at every stand-up. This is what, and your boss will eventually begin to get that you want to go to this conference and you're willing to use this as a reward scenario for work that you have done. There are some developers who will actually be inspired to hit an unreasonable goal. Give me a challenge. I can so beat that. Matter of fact, how many of you have ever met Mike Cohn, Mountain Goat Software, Scrum Master, certification guy? I actually worked for Mike very early in my career. The pithy statement is I say I worked for Mike before either of us was famous. Mike nailed one aspect about my character. He said the best way to get Ted to do something is to tell him he can't do it. I don't think you can get that done in a week. Yeah, fuck you, boss. Watch me. Watch me. Some people will like that. Other people will see it as a commitment to which they are now unwaveringly committed, and they have no control, and the feeling of commitment without control is the very definition of stress. How do you know the difference between A and B? The short answer is, as a manager, the most important thing that you can do is to get to know your people. It seems really pithy. It seems like a real, okay, wait, all of that just for this? Just get to know your people? Really? This is the whole management by walking around mentality. This is the whole open space mentality. This is the whole, look, if you're a manager and you want to get the best out of your people, talk to them. There's a lot more that we could talk about. Oh my God, I could fill up a whole rest of the day with all different kinds of management studies and tricks and so forth. But you're not the same. Realization number one. Realization number two, it's never going to get any different. And realization number three, if you are a manager, the best thing you can do is get to know the people working for you so that you can understand them better, so that you can help them become better. And if you're a developer, realization number four, the best thing you can do is talk to your boss. This is what I want, boss. I want to advance within the company. I want eventually to get into a management track. I want to become an architect. I want to go create a startup that may be outside of this company. Whatever. Good managers will help you hit your career goals, whether it's within this company or without. But he's never going to be able to do anything for you unless you say what you want. At the end of the day, talk. Bye.